Good afternoon, and welcome to our live webcast of Open Book, Open Mind online with Peter Baker and Susan Glasser talking about their New York Times bestseller, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. I'm Ariel Zeitlin, Montclair's programming librarian, and here are a few housekeeping details. Now my colleague Molly has just turned on the screen. So as you can see, whether you're using a phone, a tablet, or a computer, you have the same controls in GoToWebinar. Here's the question mark or chat box, which is your link to me and to my librarian co-host, Molly Hone, during the webcast. You can use it to get live tech help from Molly, and you'll also use it to send us your questions for the author Q&A at the end. Thank you, Molly. Now I'm going to introduce Jennifer Dan Phillips, a member of the board of our Montclair Public Library Foundation.
Thanks, Ariel. Hi, good afternoon. We are so pleased that you are all here for another virtual webcast of Open Book, Open Mind. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Foundation. We're a group of your friends and neighbors, and our mission is to raise funds that help make possible many of the free programs and services that make our libraries so special. On average, the Foundation's fundraising supports about 5% of the library's budget, and we're utilized by the library as a source of opportunistic investment. For example, as we progress through the pandemic, the Foundation has been tapped to support the significant growth in e-content. We saw an increase in e-content circulation by over 70% during the closure. Separately, it's exciting to see the library open for limited in-person services. In just the first week back in October, the community took advantage of the opening with a 30% increase in checkouts over the week prior. In these unprecedented times, the Montclair Public Library remains a constant thanks to the caring support of generous donors like you. Unfortunately, given the backdrop, we have seen a 15% decrease in our anticipated revenues, which amounts to over $500,000, and we've needed to cut back on staff by 30%. If you want to continue to see your library flourish and enjoy programs like the one we're about to experience, please consider donating to your library through our website, montclairplf.org. A gift of any size will have an impact, and your support is more needed than ever. And now enjoy the program.
Thank you, Jennifer, for so much and all that you do. And now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. President Trump is the fourth president he has covered, and he's soon to cover a new president. Previously, he covered President Obama for the Times and Bill Clinton and George W. Bush for the Washington Post. You may also have seen him quite a few times over the past week in his roles as political analyst for MSNBC and as a regular panelist on PBS's Washington Week. He is the author of 5 other books, one of which he wrote with his wife, Susan Glasser. Susan is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes a weekly column on life in Washington. Susan has served as the top editor of several Washington publications, including most recently the award-winning Political magazine. Before that, she worked for a decade at the Washington Post. She was the Post's Moscow co-bureau chief for 4 years and covered the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Susan has co-written one other book with her husband, Peter Baker. We're proud to say that Susan grew up in Montclair, and I have it on reliable authority that she spent a lot of time at the library, as all British people might do. So we welcome you back to Montclair, Susan and Peter.
Thank you.
And now I'm happy to introduce Susan and Peter's conversation partner, Jonathan Alter. Jonathan was with us just a few weeks ago to promote his own latest book, His Very Best, the first full-length biography of Jimmy Carter. Jonathan is an award-winning author, political analyst, documentary filmmaker, and radio host, and has written 3 other best-selling books, all about American presidents. He's also a longtime resident of Montclair. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Ariel.
Okay, so this is the moment we've all been waiting for. I'll be back to read the questions for our audience Q&A. And for all of you who are at home, please remember that you can start submitting your questions while Peter, Susan, and Jonathan are speaking. Thank you so much.
Welcome. This is a really exciting evening, not just for those of us from Montclair who love the library, but I think for people watching from all over the place, because we have two all-stars in our midst. I think any fair-minded observer of American politics who is trying to do, the starting lineup for the all-star team, political team this year, would have both Peter Baker and Susan Glasser on the team, which is extraordinary to have a husband-wife team that is achieving at that level. I personally don't understand how either one of you sleeps because you produce so much copy on such intense deadlines of such high quality that I can only gape in wonder at your ability to do that. And I think, many of us have been pulled through the last few years by your work and the clarifying nature of it. Now we have on top of this book, terrific book. Anybody who wants to understand how power worked in the 3 decades from 1975 through around 2007, right? Would that be about right? That would be Jim Baker's run, James A. Baker III. But anybody who wants to know about just power generally, which is always one of the great subjects for great biographers, needs to read this book. It's also astonishingly readable for a book that is about, oftentimes accounts of what they call inside baseball in Washington. The writers can lose perspective a little bit on what's really important and what isn't, what is really interesting and what is just more kind of reporting on transitory scuffling at the line of scrimmage. And Peter and Susan have a great eye for what matters and what reveals Baker's character. So I could go on all day about how great it is. But before we talk about the book, I just want to ask you a couple of questions about what's going on right now. So Peter, I saw you on television saying that Trump staying in office is not a long shot, it's a no shot. But what are the odds on him actually conceding? Are those a little better?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, thank you to Ariel and everybody at the Montclair Public Library for having us. We wish we were there in person. Believe me, this is one of our favorite places, of course, in the world is Montclair. Susan's not only grew up there, but her family is still there, and we visit as often as we can, at least when in pre-COVID times. It's a little harder now. So we're grateful to be with the Montclair community today. And we're grateful to Jonathan, who is just our favorite favorite author and one of our favorite friends. And I remember, Jonathan, when you and I were at a book club, I think it was in either 2013 or 2014, yeah. And we talked about these very 2 books. Yeah. I remember I said, well, Jonathan, you had just finished, I think, your Obama, the second book on Obama, and we were talking. I said, what's next for you? He says, well, I'm thinking about doing a biography of Jimmy Carter. And I remember being so excited that you were going to do it, because it really is a subject that nobody had done well, and nobody done at all, really, in a meaningful way. And your book is, I'm about halfway through it. It's really lived up to the promise. It's just fantastic. Anybody who wants to buy our book, please go ahead. But the other book you should be buying today is Jonathan's book on Carter. I really mean that. I'm very that.
Thank you.
In terms of, I do think that staying in office, people worry, okay, has he got some plan? Is there something that could happen? Could they overturn it? No, none of that's going to happen. These election results are solid. Nobody's found any fraud of any kind that would do anything to overturn even one state, much less the 3 states he would need. Now, is Trump going to concede? That I wouldn't put money on. No, I could see him going all the way through Inauguration Day, leaving town, heading off to Mar-a-Lago and screaming the whole way without ever admitting that he had lost the election. But you had these sort of moments like we had just today. You know, just today he tweeted out bitterly about Biden. Well, he won because of this, that, or the other reason, you know, this stolen thing or that stolen thing. But he used the phrase he won. And then of course everybody's like, aha, see, he's just conceded. And then within a couple hours, he's, you know, quickly tweeting again, he didn't win, I won, and I take it back in effect. So I think he understands what's happened here. He's making obviously a lot of noise with a lot of false claims. He's going to use that as his excuse for losing. I don't imagine we'll ever see the kind of concession that we saw from Jimmy Carter in 1980, from George H.W. Bush in 1992, or Al Gore in 2000, or most memorably in my mind, John McCain, I thought in 2008, who gave probably the best concession speech of any losing candidate in modern times. I don't think you're going to see that from Donald Trump. I would not bet money on it.
So Susan, you've done a great job in the New Yorker in explaining the kind of long-term consequences of a lot of what Trump has done. So what damage does it do to our system if he never concedes?
Well, thank you. And, you know, I second everything that Peter said, you know, especially about your book, which really is fantastic and long overdue. And also, I'm just admiring your poster of the cover, which we don't have such a man who revolutionized poster. And especially true about the Montclair Public Library. And I hope that everybody does support it. I have great, great memories of spending time there. And look, you know, had you told my previous self or any of our previous selves that this was where we would be more than a week after a US presidential election with a definitive outcome, you know, we're not talking about some kind of narrow margin. We're not talking about the 2000 presidential election, which ultimately separated the two candidates by 500,000 votes. 500,000 votes. We're talking about more than 5 million votes that separate the two candidates right now, and a definitive both popular victory and electoral college victory of 306 electoral votes. And again, you know, we're more than a week away from that. This is something that is often characterized in Trump's sort of fevered imaginings as, well, you know, it's just the process playing out and he's entitled to these lawsuits, and this is the new thing you're hearing from Republicans. But the truth is, we've never seen anything like this. This isn't just the process playing out. In fact, it's unprecedented in a way that we've become so inured to unprecedented things from the president that I think we can miss the import of this particular one, which I would have to say, when we go back and rank what are the norms that the president has blown through, what are the challenges to our democratic system, this one is going to rank at the very top. And the reason is that when you assault the integrity of the voting system itself, you're making a direct frontal assault on democracy. And you know, when I think about this, the only comparable analogies that I have are to my time as a foreign correspondent in places like Azerbaijan and Russia, where you have leaders who don't like the outcomes even when they've tried to manage them, and essentially simply defy the outcomes. And this is something that really just does not have any precedent in American history. So when you hear that, well, it's just the system playing itself out, or he's entitled to lawsuits, no, you're not entitled to deny reality. You're not entitled to come up with fake lawsuits, to spend 6 months saying that an election that hasn't taken place yet is going to be rigged. And so, again, I just would say, I know it's hard, but this is one of those Trump things that is not in the category of, well, let's just humor him, he's getting used to this unpleasant reality, you know?
Okay, well, obviously we could talk about this for the whole session, but I really want to shift the conversation to your outstanding book. Before we talk about the book itself, let's talk a little bit about the process. Yes, there have been some husband-wife, wife-husband teams. You know, Will and Ariel Durant were very famous mid-century American historians. Oscar and Mary Handlin worked on several books together, but it's challenging. And one reason I know that it's challenging, or maybe not for you, but in many other cases, is that Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, the lowest point of their entire marriage was when they wrote a book together in 1986. And at a certain point, they were just communicating by notes. Peter Osnos, their editor, had to go down and make peace between them. And they ended up, if you look at the book, which is called Everything to Gain, How to Make the Most of the Rest of Your Life, as the title of the book, they actually, one page will say JC at the bottom, the other will say RC. They never actually merged their drafts. So how about you guys? How did your marriage go in this process?
Well, we merged our drafts, so that worked out at least, and we're still speaking, so that's good. No publisher had to come and moderate or mediate. Look, as Ariel mentioned, we did one other book together, so we have a little bit of a head start on how to do this, and we actually, met in the newsroom of the Washington Post as professional colleagues. So in a lot of senses, our relationship from the very beginning has been one that it married professional and personal at the same time. So we went to Moscow together. We wrote stories all the time together. She was my editor at times during the Monica Lewinsky case. Even after we didn't work in the same newsroom, we constantly edit or help each other with our work. And the book we wrote on Russia was actually more of a challenge because we wrote that when Susan was pregnant. And in fact, we turned it in the day she had the baby. So that, this time was a lot easier. We didn't have any contractions to worry about or labor pains or anything. So I thought by the comparison, it worked out pretty well.
Susan?
Or the rebuttal.
Yeah, I'm not gonna disagree with that. Although only one of us had the baby.
That's true. That's true.
No, look, we're very lucky. And frankly, thank goodness that we worked on this together, because this ended up taking 7 years. When we started out on it, we certainly didn't envision that this project would last that long. But then, the Trump era came upon us and there were a few other distractions. So, to be so immersed in a project, I think it would have been hard, frankly, for one of us to do that without the other for such a long period of time. So, we feel really lucky.
I mean, there's so much research in it, and you guys were holding down full-time jobs the whole time. It's extraordinary how much work you managed to get done on this. So before we talk about Baker's life and career, I wanted to talk to you about Baker and Trump. So at one point you say voting against Trump should have been an easy call for Jim Baker. Why wasn't it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Susan said we started the book before Trump came along 7 years ago because Washington felt broken at the time, even before Trump. It didn't start with Trump. And Baker's time was a different kind of Washington, right? As was Carter's time. It was difficult and partisan and ruthless, but it was also a time when Washington worked on some level, at least. Today doesn't seem to work on any level. And so as Trump rose, we had this conversation with Baker repeatedly over the, every few months we would get together with him and we would talk through the latest things. We watched him struggle with this. We watched him wrestle with this. And it should have been easy from our point of view because the Bushes all voted against Trump, and the Bushes family, of course, was Baker's, closest friends, both politically and personally. You would have thought would have made it easy for him. And you would have thought it would have been easy for him in the sense that he is the un-Trump or that Trump is the un-Baker, because they're just so opposite in so many ways, just not just politics and policy, but in temperament and values. And yet he couldn't do it. And I think that tells you a lot about the modern Republican Party and how they've had a hard time figuring out what to do about this guy. They don't like him. They don't trust him. They don't respect him. And yet he has managed what Jared Kushner calls a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. And many of the establishment figures like Jim Baker and like many of the current senators and so forth, bit their tongue and stuck with him, even if they weren't happy about it. Now, our conversation with Baker made clear how much he didn't like Trump. He called him crazy. He called him nuts. Every few months he would, tell us why he thought he was going off the rails, and he wouldn't endorse him publicly. He wouldn't help him in any way publicly, but he did vote for him in the ballot box. And so it's a really interesting parable, I think, for the modern Republican Party.
But why would he want somebody who was crazy and nuts with the nuclear codes? And what is it about Baker, as opposed to Bush, who failed that particular character test?
It's a good question. And I think part of it is the reason why this book is a case study in power and not a celebration of it, right? And Baker certainly had a view during his time at the heights of Washington, and obviously it's carried over in some way, this notion that in order to wield power or to understand power, you have to be inside the tent on some level, that sort of being on the outside, screaming into the wind is not a place that he has any interest in being. He's basically a backroom politician. He's an insider by inclination and by habit. So I think that's one explanation. And then the other is, look, we asked him this question, as you might imagine, over and over and over again for the course of 5 years. And the truth is that he gave us the same answer. Over and over again, right? And if you ask somebody something so often and they tell you the same thing, at a certain point you have to listen to them. You have to listen to your subject. What are they telling you? And yeah, he made a choice to identify, or to have himself be identified as a partisan Republican, and that was the identity fundamentally that mattered to him more, and that somehow mattered to his vote more in the end. And in fact, you do notice a shift in what he said to us about 2016 versus what he said to us about the 2020 election, which is, not that he had any illusions about Trump 4 years ago, but certainly he still had in mind a kind of adults in the room scenario, which I think comes from his experience as Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, right? The idea that you could have people who would translate Trump's impulses into not just a constructive and coherent ideology, but actually into a governing program. I don't think you realized perhaps the full extent of the nihilism that was on display here. And he certainly thought that people like his friend Rex Tillerson in Texas, whom he recommended to be the Secretary of State, would have a chance to construct a plausible government. That didn't happen. We didn't hear anything about that when we asked him about his vote in 2020. Then it really was much more the full sort of Fox explanation, which is, well, yeah, I don't like Donald Trump. He's done a terrible job as president, but I'm really scared about those crazy left-wing Democrats and the socialism that they're going to bring to America.
It's so interesting because it put me in mind of something Pat Moynihan once said, that, taxes go up, taxes go down. That's not the important thing when you're looking at presidents. And in Baker's case, he was very pragmatic on taxes. He helped cut them, then he helped raise them. So you kind of wonder, like, to what end? Like, what does he actually believe in? And is it wrong to conclude that he doesn't believe in anything except power without any particular end to that power?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? I think that, look, he is a competitive guy. He believes in winning. Politics is about winning. And we talked about this a little bit off screen. I was struck by some parallels between Carter and Baker in the sense that, reading your book, about how during election campaigns, each of them was willing to trade off on things that you would not find admirable in their tactics in order to win office, with the idea that once you won office, you could be a responsible grown up and make deals on either side and pursue policies you thought were best for the country. And if you had to do things during that grubby political campaign period, it was the price of admission. And I think that has, for him, has made him into, a believer that in the decision making on who wins elections, better to have my team win than your team win. And in 1988, obviously, with the Willie Horton campaign and Dukakis and everything, he was willing to do all kinds of things with Lee Atwater and Roger Ailes that cut down Michael Dukakis. And then a month after the election, he sits down in Bob Strauss's apartment, Bob Strauss being the former DNC chair, with Jim Wright, the current Democratic Speaker of the House, to start cutting deals on governing, in effect, on the Contra War. And I think that so during election period, you see the one Jim Baker, which is what do you have to do to win? And then there's the governing Jim Baker, and right now, of course, he's not involved in the governing, and we saw the campaign side of Jim Baker.
So you have a wonderful line. You say, quote, "The present day luxury of permanent feuding as a substitute for action is something that Baker was against." He considered sort of rank partisanship to be a luxury that presumably the country doesn't have now. Would that be fair that there was a time maybe when we had that luxury, when we could just be sticking each other, but
No, I think the opposite in many ways. I mean, look, this was the framing of Jim Baker's public career was from the end of Watergate, a massive crisis, right, that had engulfed the country and certainly the entire Republican Party's governing class, from the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War and a little bit beyond. And so actually, I think he felt at that time that politics was something he was good at. He ran 5 national presidential campaigns, but that was the distraction. And that ultimately the goal was governing, it was doing something while in office, and also that governing agenda was actually how you won re-election anyways. And so I think what he would say is that today's politicians are the indulgent ones who are essentially spending 24 hours a day on demagoguery and the politics of division, and in part because they've not been held to account for their failure to govern. And again, we started this book way in the back of beyond of the Obama era, but even then, Congress hasn't passed the 13 basic appropriations bills that were the core of its constitutional obligations I think since the early George W. Bush era.
Yeah,
Is that right?
yeah.
And this is extraordinary. And in Jim Baker's Washington, unthinkable.
Yeah. So you say that he didn't just grease the gears, he shifted the gears on certain things. And we're going to get to the end of the Cold War in a few minutes. But what do you think the record should show about Jim Baker and the major things that he did, the way major that if he hadn't been there, something important wouldn't have happened? What would a short list of those be?
Well, that's a good question. I think some of them, obviously, he made Reagan's first term successful in the sense that he was able to take this Californian who didn't know how Washington worked and translate him into a functioning, if sometimes intrigue-filled and backbiting White House that got things done. Obviously, Reagan's big first term accomplishments that he cared most about were the tax cuts, then a little offset by some tax increases, as well as military spending and so forth. But I think when you put the finger on Baker specifically, the 2 really good domestic examples that I would cite would be Social Security in 1983, when the finances were about to go off the rails and it had been demagogued by the Democrats and undermined by Republicans. And after the 1982 midterm elections, he sits down with Tip O'Neill's people and he creates basically a framework for revamping Social Security that lasted for decades, put it on a stronger financial footing that lasted for decades in a way we haven't seen since. We've never seen that kind of a bipartisan, far-reaching fix to Social Security in the decades since. And the other one I would say even more impressive is the tax reform of 1986, when he sat down with Dan Rostenkowski of Chicago, the Democratic chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and basically wrote the tax code over from scratch. Basically, they got rid of a lot of loopholes, raised taxes on corporate America to some extent, gave lower taxes to some Americans, and overall didn't increase the deficit or change the overall amount of money coming into the government. They simply made it a better, fairer tax code. Imagine trying to do that today with the 2 parties. It's just not even thinkable. And I think those are examples of things that probably wouldn't have happened without Jim Baker.
Susan, Baker to this day is kind of the gold standard for White House Chief of Staff. What can Ron Klain learn from him?
Well, it's interesting. If Democrats as well as Republicans definitely do consider him to have been, the gold standard, in part, by the way, because the Reagan White House was a cesspool of intrigue and backstabbing and backbiting, and it was Baker's unique ability to, as one person said, every single day that he was in that White House, he acquired power and his enemies lost it. And, one of it is at the core was a simple appreciation, I think, for the mechanics of government and for how power actually works. And so the most famous thing that he did was right on the front end. And Baker, comes from outside Reagan's inner circle, and he is plucked from Bush world. He's run not 1 but 2 national campaigns against Ronald Reagan. It's actually kind of remarkable that Reagan's team would even have considered him for chief of staff, but partially that was because they were so filled with intrigue. And two of Reagan's advisors, Stuart Spencer and Michael Deaver, both actually claim credit for this idea, but eventually they teamed up with each other even before Reagan was elected in the fall of 1980. And they conspired to sort of put Baker in front of Reagan and to plant the seed of this idea that he would be chief of staff, in part to knock down Ed Meese, who had been chief of staff in the gubernatorial administration of Ronald Reagan, California. And he was just known as the ideological keeper of the flame of Reaganism. But the truth is, he was an administrative disaster. His briefcase was the place where papers go to die. And so, they didn't want Meese in charge. Reagan goes along with this idea, but then famously conflict averse, essentially tells Baker, now you're going to be the chief of staff, but you make it right with Ed. You two figure it out. And so Baker's first assignment was to sit down and essentially negotiate a truce with Meese. And I think that stands as a remarkable document. He literally, the corporate lawyer in him, he wrote down, on his column and Meese's column. Meese wanted a grand title and was a newcomer to Washington. So Baker gave him what seemed like a large concession, which was to make him cabinet rank, to have the status of a cabinet officer. Baker understood that, that was meaningless in Washington. And, that, of course, was really the key to the whole deal. Baker said, don't you worry, Ed, you'll be a principal. Oh, you'll be on the National Security Council. You'll be a cabinet member. I'll just handle those administrative duties like personnel and communications and liaison with Congress. Oh, and yes, I will be in charge of all the paperwork, that annoying paperwork that goes to and from the president's office. Well, of course, basically that means he was in charge of everything. And my favorite part of this whole story is that after they negotiate this, and Baker's already essentially rolled him completely, Meese says, oh, one more thing, Jim. I would really like to have the right to attend any one of President Reagan's meetings in the Oval Office at any time. And Baker says, absolutely, Ed, that makes perfect sense to me. I'm just, for symmetry's sake, going to put that down on my side. And so with that stroke, Meese had thereby immediately traded away the ability to meet privately with Ronald Reagan ever. Jim Baker had the right on paper to always do it. So I love that story, and I think it does tell you an awful lot about the man.
So was he effectively co-president with Reagan, who was kind of detached?
Well, I think, yeah, that was certainly what Brent Scowcroft called him at one point. I think there's something to that. Obviously, he had, Reagan was the visionary, if you will. He articulated the larger principles he wanted to pursue, but he wasn't obviously a detail guy by any stretch. And it was Baker who managed the ship, made things work. I mean, Baker understood that, like, Reagan may have told the right that he was going to abolish the Department of Education created by Jimmy Carter, but Baker also understood that was a no-winner. They were never going to get that through a Democratic House, and they had a Democratic House the entire Reagan presidency and Bush presidency. And so why waste your time on something that isn't going to happen? So he puts that to the side and he focuses on the things that can be done. So he helps Reagan, I think, prioritize and figure out what's doable and what's just, chafe. Now that's how you get the let Reagan be Reagan complaints among the Reaganites, which is really a jab at Baker. How come you're manipulating him? How come you're not letting him do what he wants to do? That was always overstated. In fact, Richard Viguerie, we interviewed him for this book, he actually admitted, yeah, we went after Baker because we were really disappointed in Reagan, but we couldn't take shots at Reagan. So we had to take shots at Baker as an excuse, in effect. And that was true because Baker did what Reagan wanted him to do. There were times when Reagan got mad at him, and Baker, of course, shifted gears immediately if Reagan did. So it wasn't like he was doing things that Reagan didn't want. Reagan was more of a pragmatist than people gave him credit for anyway. But Baker was the front guy who would take the arrows from the right, which was disappointed in Reagan for not being purist enough.
So in the second term, Baker and Donald T. Reagan swap jobs, and Baker becomes Treasury Secretary. And then under Bush, he becomes Secretary of State. But one of the best regarded secretaries of state in Washington since Kissinger. But I was really surprised to learn that he was blindsided by Bush on the selection of Dan Quayle to be Bush's running mate in 1988. Why would Bush blindside his old tennis partner, very close friend, guy who he brought into politics? You know, their relationship in some ways is at the heart of your book. It's a fascinating relationship. Why would he blindside him that way?
You know, I think you're right to spotlight that, Jonathan. Is probably one of the biggest crises in their relationship, and it was almost a petulant assertion of who was really in charge on the part of Bush. And you know, it wasn't just Baker he kept this a secret from, but the rest of his campaign apparatus in ways that really obviously came back to bite him. This was a very unsuccessful rollout of a vice presidential nominee, to say the least. And it, you know,
I was there at the dock.
You were.
story.
What a scene, right?
It was a disaster. And here's Jim Baker, who's famous for, you know, his mantra, prior preparation prevents poor performance. And here they are doing the most half-assed rollout of a vice presidential candidate ever, literally including leaving the vice president to find his own way to that ceremony in New Orleans. A complete debacle, and just from a logistics point of view. But more importantly, I think, is what it said about their relationship, with Bush finally coming out of 8 years of being the loyal but sort of, you know, disregarded vice president in Reagan's era. And the truth is that Jim Baker star burned brighter during the Reagan era, and certainly he had far more day-to-day practical power and influence when he was the chief of staff and essentially running Reagan's government in the first term, and then wins all the accolades for this 1986 tax reform that essentially is the major success legislatively of Reagan's second term, which is otherwise bogged.
Susan, I can't hear you.
Yeah,
You're
Susan.
frozen.
Susan's wireless.
Yeah.
Susan,
You guys leave the conversation and come back. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I'm going to call them on the phone. Hold on just a minute, people. Let's see if we can.
Why don't I, while we're getting Susan and Peter back, why don't I just talk about some of the other things that they have in this part of the book. When he becomes Bush's Secretary of State, we're talking obviously about George Herbert Walker Bush. This is exactly at the time that the Cold War is winding down. You know, the Berlin Wall falls, and then they have this question about the reunification of Germany. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that, and the book does a very good job of explaining this.
Oh, there we are. Hi, can you see us?
Yes, now you're
Sorry
back.
about that.
Okay, so I was just starting, while you were off, I was just explaining that Bush was president and Baker was Secretary of State at one of the most pivotal moments of the 20th century, when the Berlin Wall fell and Germany was reunified, and we had a peaceful end to the Cold War, which, to my mind, if you look at the larger scope of history, this was by far George Bush's greatest accomplishment, because by all odds, it should have ended violently. There's very little in human history. There's almost no examples of an empire collapsing in anything but a violent, often extraordinarily violent fashion. So by all accounts, there should have been some kind of war in that period, and there wasn't. And one of the things I learned from your book is at that climactic meeting with Gorbachev on the Soviet ship, the Maxim Gorky, what Bush said to Gorbachev about how basically we're not going to gloat. We are not going to dance on the Berlin Wall. And it sounded to me like this was Bush's greatness, and that it really, I kept looking for, you know, Jim Baker is the one who urged Bush not to gloat. And that decision not to gloat was so important historically. And it feels to me, and just correct me if I'm wrong, that this is something we should put on George Bush's list of accomplishments, because whether it was, you know, his own background where he was taught by his mother not to brag or whatever it was, you know, he did the right thing at the key moment. Is that fair, or should Baker get some of the credit?
No, I think that's Bush. You're right. I think Bush is the lead at that point, and it is his instinct. It is his instinct probably from his childhood, but it's also his instinct, I think, from a strategic calculation that you don't rub the other guy's nose in it when things are going badly for him, especially because, you know, what he understood was, as you point out, this didn't have to end the way it ended. I mean, you know, had they really danced on the wall, to use that figure of speech, they could have easily riled the conservatives in Moscow to rise up against Gorbachev, who was basically allowing the empire to slip away. He was basically giving Eastern Europe a chance to be on its own, and that was not a popular decision within the Kremlin. And had the Americans, you know, nya, haha, really really made that a thing, there's no question that it could have turned out differently. So I think that was Bush's perception, but Baker, of course, went along with it. I think that was his instinct as well. He didn't need to give Bush that advice. And I don't think he disagreed with him. I think he thought that was the prudent, to use a phrase, thing to do, and he echoed it.
Well, I would say, though, that there are two areas, though, in which it was really Baker rather than Bush who not only took the lead at this moment in time, but, you know, potentially the actual results would have been different as a result. So I do think that there was this initial overall tone of restraint, which was absolutely set by Bush. But Baker not only had the lead in dealing with the Soviet Union as it was collapsing, but he did two things that I think are the reason that he's widely regarded as certainly the best Secretary of State since Kissinger, and arguably as consequential, if not more so, than Kissinger. And the reason why that's on Baker's portfolio as opposed to purely George Bush's is number one, what we chose to do and the incredible feat of American diplomacy that was involved in bringing the parties together to create German reunification in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was Jim Baker's accomplishment as much and probably more so than George Bush's. And this is really probably his most important moment in his entire public career. And when you look at the sheer number of things that could have gone wrong, the number of negotiating partners involved, the fact that it wasn't just the Soviets who were unhappy about losing control over East Germany, it wasn't just the two Germanys, East Germany and West Germany. Baker also had to manage feuding factions within West Germany. The foreign minister and the chancellor of Germany were literally not on speaking terms and had to operate through Baker. And then, of course, you also had the Brits. Margaret Thatcher was violently opposed. So was Francois Mitterrand. Both of them had fought 2 world wars against Germany and were not eager to see it reinvigorated at the center of Europe. And so that was really, I think, Baker's key moment as a diplomat. And then the other thing that he did was that he really was, the key one in the partnership between him and Bush, who was, I think, bringing the real-time intelligence and understanding of what was happening in the Soviet Union. And in part and largely that was because of the unique personal relationship he forged with Edward Shevardnadze, who was the Soviet foreign minister in the decline of the Soviet Union. He did something on the front end. He invited Shevardnadze to come to Wyoming, to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, which Baker, people don't realize this necessarily, but he's as much a man of the West as he is of Texas in many ways. And for him, Wyoming was sort of his special place ever since he was a young boy and went there with his father. And he invited Shevardnadze. This had never happened before. The previous Soviet foreign minister was Andrei Gromyko, Mr. No. And so, to have the two of them, fishing, fly fishing and, schmoozing in the woods was a big moment. And in some ways, Shevardnadze and later Gorbachev confided in Baker more than they did to any officials in their own government about the nature of the crisis that they were facing.
It's just astonishing. That trip, can you imagine? And so before we get to his time after government with Bush and Gore, and we just have a few minutes left, I wanted to ask you about his personal life. He born into wealth in Houston, went to Princeton. His first wife died in 1970. And so I guess I would ask, was that a a pivot point in his whole career, the death of Mary Baker?
Yeah, it's a really important moment because I think up until that point, he had not really been involved in politics at all. His friendship with George H.W. Bush was forged on the tennis courts of the country club in Houston, and their families got together at Thanksgiving and played, turkey ball and all these kinds of things. But there wasn't a political path at that point for Baker. The family, he was the fourth James Addison Baker, even though he was James A. Baker III. We're not really sure why it's still the third after four of them. We spent 7 years in the book, never solved that mystery. But the family had always been anti-politics. The family slogan was work hard, study, and keep out of politics. But when Mary Stuart dies, it's his friend George Bush who he confides in. He's the one person he actually tells that the cancer diagnosis is terminal. He doesn't even tell Mary Stuart this, thinking he's sparing her, although of course she really knew. He didn't tell his kids this. He didn't tell his wife this. I mean, his mother this. The one person in the world he tells is George Bush, which tells you a lot more about the friendship we were just talking about and why it was rooted in something so profound beyond politics. And Bush says to him after Mary Stuart dies, of course, this is a famous story, but he says, you got to come work on my Senate campaign, help work through your grief. And Baker was already beginning to get interested in politics even before then, but really, you're right, it's the turning point. He's 40 years old, and suddenly he finds this new path forward, this new area of interest. It turns out he's good at it. And within a few years, he's in Washington as an undersecretary of commerce. And then suddenly a year after that, he's running the incumbent president's re-election campaign. And as Susan said, it's partly the blow up of the Watergate generation that allows that vacuum to be filled by a nobody like a Jim Baker. But you're right. I think that pivot point in his life, 1970, is really critical to understanding how and it talks about the accidents of history, right? History could have been very different, but for that moment.
So just one quick, and I think relevant now, intersection with Jimmy Carter is that in 1990, when Carter was long out of office, he went with Jim Baker's approval to monitor the Nicaraguan election. And he stayed up all night convincing Daniel Ortega, the communist leader of Nicaragua, to step down because he lost the election. And unlike Trump, Ortega actually followed Carter's advice. Carter said, I know what it's like to lose, and you can make a comeback, which Ortega later did. And he was able to get him out of office. And at that point, according to your book, even though they had big issues later on, Jim Baker and George Bush, and I interviewed Bush about this not long before he died, they loved Jimmy Carter right then because he solved a big problem for them, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, it's interesting. Baker told us that he really always had liked Jimmy Carter. He said, not many Republicans did. He hadn't been very welcome, in the White House, but that Baker had sought out his advice previously. And that moment, you're right, it's a shocking echo of our current situation. If only President Carter was well enough to fly up from Georgia and have a word with Donald Trump right now, maybe we'd all be better off. But people forget that the Contra wars and was probably the most divisive foreign policy issue in American politics throughout the 1980s. And Baker was so eager to get that off of his plate at the beginning of his tenure as Secretary of State. He understood that the real action, the main event, if you will, was this final decisive moment in the Cold War. And he and Bush understood they really wanted to focus on Gorbachev and the Soviet Union, what was happening there. They needed to move beyond this had been a debilitating issue. And Carter emerges as this sort of unlikely partner there. And it was a huge fight, by the way, even inside the Bush administration. Baker had to push and push to get this deal whereby they would have these elections. It was very controversial, and they were worried that Ortega would win. So it was like this great delight, actually, and relief for Baker when not only did they have the elections, but actually, from their perspective, the outcome was even better than they had expected to.
Yeah, we interviewed President Carter. So we have interviewed President Carter about this. He said that Baker treated him better than anybody after he left office, certainly better than the Reagan people had, even better than the Clinton.
Way better than the Clinton, but he told me the same thing. So finally, my last question is about the 2000 aftermath when Baker led George W. Bush's efforts in Florida and kind of mopped the floor with Warren Christopher, who was Al Gore's person. I guess Giuliani is now Trump's Jim Baker, but tell me whether you, what it was, people have seen the movie Recount, but what was it about Jim Baker that allowed him to so dominate that situation and essentially assure that his best friend's son would become president?
Well, essentially, we interviewed Ron Klain, aforementioned new chief of staff in the White House, about this for the book. And he said that once they knew that Baker had been appointed to be Bush's guy, they knew they were probably going to lose, because Baker had this aura of being a winner, right? He had this, even though they had lost the 92 election, Baker still had this gravitas that and this combination of both political and statesman backgrounds, right? So Warren Christopher, everybody respected, really very solid, decent person, was a good Secretary of State, but he didn't have the sort of political knife fighting skills that Jim Baker had. Jim Baker managed to be both a political guy and a statesman guy when he needed to be either one of those things. And he kind of brought both of them together in this moment where he was able to both communicate to the public that Bush was ahead, that he was still ahead after all the recounts, and then behind the scenes to tell the Republicans, look, we need to go to the US Supreme Court. It's the only way we're going to win this thing. Get over your federalism arguments about not taking state matters to the federal courts, because if you want to win, this is the way to do it. So he didn't stand on ideology, he didn't stand on ceremony. He did what you had to do to win. That was always Baker's thing. It was no good unless you won. And so now the difference, though, I would say between then and now, aside from the fact that we're talking about tens of thousands of votes in multiple states and nothing like the Florida situation, but the biggest difference to me is that Baker fought within the system. And so did Al Gore, and so did George Bush. In other words, they fought within the system, and when it was over, they all said, okay, we accept what's happened here. And Al Gore gave a gracious concession speech in which he said, George W. Bush is now my president. And George W. Bush gave a gracious victory speech in which he said, I'm president of all the people, the Democrats and the Republicans. And neither side tried to burn the house down. And that's what's happening right now, is you're seeing the house being burned down by somebody who doesn't seem to respect the system.
On that happy note, Ariel, I'm going to turn it over to you and the other people who are on this call. Thank you, guys. That was terrific.
Thank you, Jonathan. We loved it. A lot of fun.
Thank you so much. And Jonathan, good save there. We do sometimes have glitches in this tech era, as we all know. We do have a bunch of questions already, and I'm interested to hear what you'll think of them. Okay, so Mark says, unlike the former days when Jim Baker and Jimmy Carter were in the White House, how can you and other White House correspondents obtain detailed comments on background from administration officials? With the virus, journalists generally operate from their homes and don't conduct face-to-face meetings with sources. Are White House officials willing to email or say their comments with the interview always sight unseen?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, obviously it's not the same. We're not seeing each other up close the way we often do. This is a very different White House than the Carter White House or the Reagan or Bush White House in so many different ways. We communicate with them by text, by email, by phone. The problem is, it's hard to know which ones you can trust and which ones you can't. It's not a White House, like Jim Baker made his bones partly by saying, I would never lie to reporters. And we interviewed a lot of reporters who covered him back then, and they'll say, he might have spun me this way or the other, but he never lied to me. And that's a real problem with this White House, is knowing who to trust and who not to trust. And that's a big difference.
Okay. So Patty wants to know, has anyone made it clear that Peter is not related to Jim Baker?
That's true. This is true. Yes, not related. Not at all related. But it's a great last name.
Okay. Marjorie says, do you think the elimination of earmarks has led to legislative gridlock? In the old days, you could get stuff for different states with some give and take, even if it included the bridge to nowhere.
Look, that is a good question. Many reforms, and that was an intended reform, have unintended consequences. I don't think in and of itself it is the reason for our current gridlock, but there is a whole host of things that have happened with Congress structurally that have changed what it was from the Congress of Jim Baker's era or previous legislative eras. And, members of Congress do not spend time in Washington. That's probably the biggest change. And they don't know each other, and they don't have an investment in the institution in the same way. And when we've heard Jim Baker ask this question many times, and he often will cite that in addition to extreme gerrymandering as the two biggest changes. Of course, the changes in campaign fundraising that require enormous sums of money and that have brought unaccountable large money donors into the system outside of the party rubric is another massive change. And the general war on the government, which started out as a rhetorical war in many ways. Ronald Reagan famously, talked about government and characterized it as if it was the problem or the enemy. But now you have one of the two political parties for 4 decades have made this a pillar of their ideology. And in particular, I think the sort of Gingrich revolution from that point forward on, I think you just had a set of structural changes in Congress that have made it almost impossible and bearing less and less resemblance to the Congress that Jim Baker was able to so masterfully work with back in the 1980s and early 90s.
Okay, thank you. So Edward wants to know, after the election results, the Trump campaign was apparently looking for a Baker-like persona to handle the legal machinations of the campaign to repudiate the results. Did the Trump campaign actually approach Baker himself?
Well, we called him to ask him that because we were curious what he thought about it. He said no, they hadn't approached him, and he was just as happy that they hadn't. I don't think he would have taken the case. There's such a big difference. I mean, when the Florida case happened, you had one state in which everything was on the money. Whoever won that state would have won the election. And on election night, the difference was 1,700 votes. After the machine recount, which is automatic, would happen no matter what, it was only 357 votes. So Al Gore had a very plausible argument to say, hey, it's only 357 votes. I think we should try to have a further recount to see if those votes are still there, if some were disqualified inappropriately. And what Baker told us when we talked about this is that's a huge difference. They didn't, Baker and Bush never said stop the count. There were 2 counts before they even got to the legal fight with the Democrats. What Trump was saying was we shouldn't even count them in the first place. We shouldn't even have the first count. And it shouldn't matter if they voted against him. Basically, they should be thrown out. Such a different thing. This is why you're seeing law firms drop off the Trump case, because there is no case there. They have made no allegation of actual fraud on a massive scale the way the president talks about. So Baker would be embarrassed, I think, to be any part of it and wouldn't have any part of it.
Okay. Now, Jeff says, who in Trump's administration do you think will have staying power? Which presumes that somebody will.
Well, that's right. It presumes that somebody will. I mean, look, one thing is that Trump may have avoided a reckoning for a long time in his life. But look at the story of the Nixon era or of other previous scandals. People make comebacks in our politics and in Washington. And, I think you will see simultaneously after Trump leaves on January 20th, on the one hand, you will see some people who are quick to disavow him in the Republican Party, who pretend that they never had anything to do with him. They never liked him all along. They were simply, trying to deal with it. But Trump has built up an enormous and obsessive following. He's gotten an extremely large number of votes in this election. Those people are not simply going to disappear. And you already see a very public competition for the loyalty of those, extreme Trump voters. And, that's why when Donald Trump Jr. complained in a tweet after the election, where are the Republicans? Why aren't they helping us enough? The 2024 Republicans, you immediately saw Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham literally within hours was showing up on Sean Hannity on Fox News and, essentially doing everything it could to keep flattering Trump and to keep his fake quest for redemption alive. So I think the competition for the Trump base means that these people will be actively engaged in this sort of alternate universe of pro-Trump media that will continue to exist. So, will they be welcomed in to the traditional institutions that, welcome people after administrations, the Kennedy School and, big jobs at Goldman Sachs? Probably not. Probably not. Mark Esper might be the one lucky guy because he's the defense secretary who just got fired last week. Donald Trump did him a huge favor, in my view, because this guy, when he was appointed, was so seen as being so obsequious to Trump and his wishes, he was nicknamed Yesper by officials in the Pentagon who were concerned that he was trading away their independence. Well, by firing him and making him a martyr, and Esper has now put out publicly the idea that he broke with Trump over the outrageous Lafayette Square photo op. So it seems to me that Donald Trump has been very helpful in rehabilitating him, but most people will not have that assist from the president.
Okay. This one is let's see. Tanya says, how would you compare and contrast James Baker as chief of staff versus Mark Meadows?
Well, I mean, look, when Trump actually hired Meadows to be his fourth, I think, chief of staff, he actually told people, I want him to be my Jim Baker. But the problem is, of course, he didn't really want him to be his Jim Baker, because what Ronald Reagan did was to make Jim Baker, empower him, to make him capable of being successful. And there's no chief of staff who can manage Donald Trump. I mean, we've seen that. That's been very clear. You could be a Reince Priebus, John Kelly, Mick Mulvaney, or Mark Meadows. Nobody is going to suddenly be this guy's handler, especially when you have, competing power centers within that White House, like, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump on the one hand, or Stephen Miller and that wing on the other hand. So, Meadows, even if he had been Jim Baker reincarnate, probably would not have been able to replicate the success that Baker had in the Reagan White House, because you have a very different president. You have a president who thinks he's his own chief of staff, his own communications director, his own everything. And it's a wonder why anybody would want to take that job, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I often think that that would be the hardest job in the world, is to work in that White House.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't seem to go well for almost anybody who works there. Okay, Thomas says, do we run the risk today of waxing too nostalgic about the good old days and canonizing the likes of Reagan and Baker, especially since many of the most troubling aspects of today's Republican Party were seeded and cultivated during the 1980s?
Yeah, I think this is something that Peter and I thought a lot about in doing the book. And, I think if you read it, you'll see it's not an exercise in nostalgia. Baker himself has been very generous, both in cooperating with us, but also recognizing that, the book is very much what he's called a warts and all portrait. He would laugh and say, well, I didn't mean all the warts. But, the truth is that it's one thing to try to understand power and how it's wielded. And Baker, I think there is, a uniquely successful practitioner of it, with lessons, some of which are universal and apply to any era in Washington or other capital cities, and some of which are very unique and specific to that particular moment of late Cold War America. But to the question about politics and how it's changed and how it hasn't, look, clearly there was a functionality and there were structural incentives to get the work of government done in a way that no longer exists right now, I think much to our collective detriment. There were also absolutely boundaries and guardrails around the presidency, around public life. Didn't mean there weren't scandals. Anyone who spent any time in Washington knows that, scandals do not have a party label on them. Democrats have scandals, Republicans have scandals. The Carter presidency had scandals. The Reagan presidency had Iran-Contra, which was perhaps the most serious presidential scandal, in some ways a direct antecedent to Donald Trump's perfect phone call with Ukraine type scandal. So it's not, you can't look at that and say, well, that was just a golden era in our politics, although I think structurally the incentives existed to get things done. And there was a compulsion for the two parties to work together in that system of divided government, that our current system of divided government has moved in the other direction. And, again, what I would say is that Baker, on many of the fights that seem to be direct precursors to where the Republican Party moved, things like the culture wars and, the internal fights, the use of racist dog whistles by Reagan, Baker was, generally speaking, on the other side of those fights. He was seen internally and was generally the establishment Republican of that era. He didn't like the new Gingrich-style politics of confrontation that were rising up in the House of Representatives in the 1980s. He was just stylistically and substantively anathema to the Gingrich Republicans, but they were also the same Republicans. He was the guy who ran the 1988 Scorched Earth campaign and used Willie Horton in that campaign against Michael Dukakis. And not just Willie Horton, by the way, it just generally turned Michael Dukakis, a mild-mannered technocrat, essentially from Massachusetts, into Pledge of Allegiance hating, flag burning enemy of his country. And so we are where we are as a country, but I'd say there are many authors of that disaster.
Thank you. So Peter and Susan are standing by. We can take a few more questions if somebody would like to volunteer one. I actually have a question for you, and this is a question I kind of wanted to ask you too, Jonathan. When you've interviewed so many heads of state and so many powerful people, what's that like? Are they different from regular people? Do they have something in common? Do they have some kind of aura of power?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Baker is a very dynamic figure, even well into his 80s, which is when Peter and I encountered him. We spent dozens of hours with him, and he could not have been more generous in this. I think, the thing that Baker has that I've noticed in others at his level in politics, an unbelievable energy and resilience and, endurance. I mean, look at Madeleine Albright, also,
Right.
I think she's just about 90. She's the same age, actually. Maybe
Yeah.
she's 89, I think.
George Shultz turning 100.
George Shultz turning 100. Henry Kissinger still around.
Carter's the oldest president ever.
That's right. Incredible energy. And in Baker's case, he came from this very pedigreed family, but he has an incredible ability to meet people where they are and to interact with them at whatever level. And he understood that, I was a kid from Montclair, New Jersey. And, when he took us on a tour of his ranch and, forgot his shotgun and warned us that, there are often grizzly bears and mountain lions, where we happened to be at that exact moment. He knew that, we weren't going to be like, shooting the heads off of animals together. But he has an innate ability to, sort of engage with, somebody from Soviet Georgia, as well as somebody from the country club. And I think that's something we've seen in other world leaders.
So I guess my answer to that question would be that it partly depends on the setting. I've interviewed every president going back to Nixon, with the exception of Reagan. And the ones in the Oval Office were definitely more intimidating than the ones that were at their house or in their office. And then you really feel the presidency. When it's a former president, or in Trump's case, I interviewed him before he was president, it's not as intimidating. The other thing that I think is common to almost all of them, and I'm sure that you guys have had this experience, is they all talk a lot. They're politicians, and not all of them talk as much as Joe Biden, for instance, or Bill Clinton, but Obama. They all love to hear the sound of their own voice. That's why they are politicians. Often you have limited time. So especially when the person's in office, you might only have 20 minutes. And your editor is going to kill you if you only ask 2 questions in those 20 minutes. So you're constantly having to cut in on the president of the United States. Very hard thing to do. And with Carter, Carter doesn't have that sort of larger than life quality that some other presidents have had, where when he walks in the room, you know it. He's diminutive, and he just doesn't have that same aura. But he's intimidating in his own way, because I think people's impression of him and what he's like is often wrong. He's a very tough guy who will bore into you with his steely blue eyes or his not terribly friendly smile if you've said something that he doesn't like. And I think the most scared I was when I was working on a Habitat for Humanity project with him in Memphis, and on the work site with him. And at one point he comes over and he's not happy with my hammering. He shows me how it's done. And he was like, this was in 2016. He was 92, and he's just like knocking them in with like 3 strokes, and when I read up on some of his other encounters, the same thing happened to Bill Clinton, who, when he was running for president, went to a Habitat site with the Carters, and Carter really showed him up. And then on Johnny Carson afterward, he told Carson how bad Clinton was as a hammerer.
Oh,
That kind of dovetails into what Peter and Susan are saying, which is that these are these, kind of supermen who are, they are very energetic. They have a lot of physical stamina, a lot of power, and they've got that staying power. I do have another question here. This is from Jelana, and she would like to know about the division of labor in writing the book. For instance, was it by topic or by chapter, or some other method?
Well, Peter did all the hard work. That's the real story. Look, we did it differently this time than we did when we wrote Kremlin Rising, our book about Vladimir Putin's Russia. It was much easier. That was based on our 4 years there as correspondents. And we essentially came up with an outline and divided it up 50-50. And many of the stories were outgrowths of stories we'd written for the Washington Post and going deeper on subjects that we'd done. So that was almost a very straightforward, we each do it and then we trade the chapters back and forth. Now, you can't do that when you have just one subject and it's a biography, and the characters come in and out of many of the different chapters. And Peter also had the privilege of having 2 different book leaves for the book. So he had the chance to spend a lot more time just purely concentrating on it. So basically, he did all the good parts, and anything you didn't like, that's my fault.
No, that's not true. We traded drafts back and forth, though, and every time the draft came back from Susan, it was a heck of a lot better. I would say that you could definitely see parts of it that are Susan's. Usually, when people quote a line, as Jonathan did at the beginning, it's almost always a line that Susan had written.
Well, it's nice to hear a writing team compliment each other. So do we have any other questions? Because otherwise, I think we just want to ask you, what next? You have another writing project coming up?
Well, we do. If Donald Trump ever actually leaves office, we will turn our attention to the story of what has just happened in the last 4 years in America. And we're still figuring out what that would be, but basically we want to do a book that we'll be starting work on now, that will be finished sometime next year, that will be a look at Trump versus Washington, and what did this disruption of the last few years, what kind of an effect did it have on institutions like the enemies of the people, that's us, and the Congress and the institutions, the White House that we're talking about here. In some ways, it'll be a follow-up to our Baker book. What does it mean to be chief of staff for Donald Trump? What did it mean to have a National Security Council with decision-making about foreign policy coming by tweet without informing your security officials? So that's our next project, whatever it is, and wish us luck.
Ariel, do we have a little bit more time? Can I ask them a couple more questions about that? What time are we supposed to go until?
It's flexible, but we do have a little more time. So go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay. So let's talk about that a little bit. Your next book. I am in awe of that because I'm tired of Trump squatting in my brain, and I have a second book to write on my contract with my publisher, and all that I've told my publisher is it will not be about Donald Trump. But you guys have done such great reporting that it's perfectly natural and smart for you to do this book. And I guess I'm wondering if you think, so I read a piece today by Hugh Hewitt, who is a Trump apologist, smart radio talk show host, who believes that Trump has a good record, that if you look at the record, it's actually good. I think he's completely full of it on that, but I would ask you what you think of the Trump record of accomplishment or lack thereof.
And also, what do you think of Hugh Hewitt?
Well, look,
Yeah, don't get me started on him.
yeah,
But,
look, I think like a lot of things with Donald Trump, it's the Rorschach test of politics, right? If you see in him somebody who has, who's supposed to come to Washington to bust it up because that's what you wanted. Well, he came to Washington, he kind of busted it up. Now, what did he accomplish? I mean, he cut taxes. Okay, cutting taxes is not the hardest thing in the world. It's, politically speaking, that's the kind of easy thing that they do. He signed the criminal justice reform. I don't think he had much involvement in it personally, but he did do it. He kept I think you could say on the economy, he kept the economy going, right? He would argue greatest economy ever. That's simply not true. It more or less kept going at the same pace that it was when he took office from Obama. In fact, even a little bit less in terms of growth and new jobs. Even the stock market wasn't even quite as good as Obama's last 3 years of the stock market. But he kept it going, and that's, you could argue that's an accomplishment until the COVID came along. And obviously, if you don't like immigration, he's done an awful lot to crack down on immigration. Now, you balance that, of course, against 230-some thousand people who died during a pandemic that he has yet to take very seriously. Certainly isn't taking it very seriously right now. You balance that against, division and strife and, racial and otherwise in this country. You balance that against, taking the levers of government and making them, your personal tools of power, like the Justice Department. I think those are the things that are more lasting and things where there's some real tangible consequences to that. What's happened to future administrations? He did violate so many norms, so many boundaries we thought had been erected after Watergate. Does that mean now that these norms and boundaries are gone? Or do future presidents come along and say, okay, we're putting them back up again, and he was a one-time aberration? I don't know the answer yet.
Susan, did you?
Look, honestly, Jonathan, that's just claptrap from Hugh Hewitt. And Hugh is somebody who is like many Republican establishment figures. He was against Donald Trump until he was for him, and was one of the people who, like Lindsey Graham, who called him a kook and a maniac, and have since become, very public advocates for him. I'm hard pressed to think of any quote unquote accomplishment of Donald Trump's that would stand independent. I think there has been a marked shift in terms of Republicans and Democrats on certain foreign policy issues in the course of the last 4 years. For example, a recognition among Democrats as well as Republicans that the previous strategy of strategic engagement with China has failed. Do you attribute that to Trump, and is that an accomplishment? I don't think so. I think it's a transitional moment when it comes to that particular issue. But honestly, I'm actually very hard pressed to think of anything that would stand as a lasting quote unquote accomplishment in and of itself of the Trump presidency. And I can think of a lot of things, and most notably the mismanagement of a pandemic that's cost so many lives and so much damage to our country. Sometimes we overthink these things. Honestly, like this one isn't hard. We know how history is going to judge Donald Trump. I think that part we do know.
Yeah, I just, since we're in overtime, I'll give you my 4 sentences on what his legacy is. Public health menace, racist demagogue, dangerous autocrat, incompetent whiner.
Yeah, I think that sums it up pretty much, Jonathan. You and I are on the same page here.
I have one more question here. And then I think we're gonna move along, but I just want to get in my plug first for your book that we want you to come back and do it again, all over again when you have your next book. But if James Baker would have accepted, this is from Clayton, if James Baker would have accepted a position as COS, Chief of Staff, I guess, in Trump's White House, how long do you think he would have lasted?
He never would have accepted it. Jim Baker is a smart man, and he might have voted for Donald Trump, but he sees very clearly who he is, and he only took on assignments that he thought he could win at. And as Peter very carefully said, you couldn't win at being chief of staff in a White House for a president who doesn't want to have a chief of staff, and he never would have taken the job.
Okay, this is one last, okay, I'm gonna have one last one. This is for you, Susan. It's from Mark. In growing up in Montclair, what did you experience that assisted you in becoming a journalist?
I went to the library.
Okay, we can just stop right here because this is the best part of the show. No, thank you so much.
And I did, by the way, I absolutely did. And it was a wonderful thing. And my dad would take us to the library every week and we would get new books and come back. And, you know, Montclair's a wonderful town. It was maybe not the, you know, New York Times ghetto that it is become in recent years, but filled with smart, interesting people. And, you know, I went to the Montclair public schools and got a great education, and happy that my parents still live there in the same place where I grew up. So I want to just thank you and everybody at the library, and all these great questions, by the way, as well as Jonathan. Great conversation.
Thank you so much for coming, Peter, Susan, and Jonathan. And thanks to everybody for joining us today, because without you, there is no program. And I want to let you know that, okay, this is an embarrassing moment, but The Man Who Came to Washington is available through the library. We also want to encourage you to consider buying the book through our partner, Watchung Booksellers, which is our local indie bookstore and also our partner, and to support our writers in this time. And finally, we hope that you'll join us for our next event, which is on Sunday, December 6th at 4 p.m., which is Alice Hoffman in conversation with Elizabeth Egan of the New York Times Book Review. And that's about Alice's latest New York Times best-selling novel, Magic Lessons. And next season, we're also going to have Ann Patchett and Isabel Wilkerson. So we'll be sending details about these events to all of today's attendees, and be well, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks again.
Thanks, Ariel.
Guys, thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.